Winter. In the frozen north, where the land meets the edge of the world, it isn't just a season. It's a force, one so immense, so unforgiving, that it becomes the very backdrop of life itself. As the dark nights stretch on and the chill grips the air, the cold becomes more than just a physical discomfort. It transforms into an enemy, relentless and unyielding, forcing those who dare to live through it to test their very limits. In this unforgiving environment, survival is not a guarantee, it's an act of defiance. Imagine, if you will, the breath of winter sweeping across the land, the wind so sharp that it cuts through the flesh like ice itself. The ground, frozen solid and white with snow, offers no softness to those who walk upon it. The nights are endless, stretching far beyond what the human mind can comprehend. For the Vikings, this darkness was not simply the absence of light. It was the embodiment of death, lurking just beyond the horizon. In the northernmost regions of Scandinavia, where the Vikings roamed, the cold wasn't just a discomfort, it was a constant companion that weighed heavily on every aspect of life. The days would shorten drastically, swallowed by a darkness so thick it seemed to press against the very soul. For months, the sun barely appeared above the horizon, casting long shadows and offering little warmth to the frozen earth below. In those months, the very air seemed to freeze in place, hanging in thick layers that made every breath feel like an inhale of ice. The Vikings, known for their strength and courage, were not immune to the cruelty of these winters. They knew what it meant to wake up to the sound of cracking ice underfoot, to hear the wind howl through the trees like the wails of lost souls, and to see the sky darken long before the evening hours arrived. For them, the winter was not merely a passing phase of the year, it was a part of their existence, shaping their lives in ways both subtle and stark. The cold would seep into their bones, making every movement feel sluggish and laborious. It would twist the landscape into something unrecognizable, stripping away the familiar sights and sounds of everyday life, replacing them with the bleak and empty quiet of frozen wilderness. For the Vikings, the entire world seemed to fall asleep, as if the very earth itself had been paralyzed by the cold. And yet, in the face of such overwhelming adversity, they did not succumb. There was something about the Vikings, a spirit, a drive, that refused to bow to the forces of nature. It wasn't that they had an easy life, nor did they possess some unnatural ability to withstand the cold. They simply understood that survival was not just about strength or endurance. It was about ingenuity, creativity, and the relentless will to adapt to their environment. To survive in such a harsh and unforgiving place, the Vikings had to think differently. They couldn't afford to be complacent, to wait for the storm to pass. They had to build something that would not only withstand the winter but thrive in it. As the winds howled through the trees and the snow piled high around their homes, the Vikings took action. They built shelters, yes, but they built them with an understanding of the cold's power, with a keen awareness of how nature worked and how they could work with it. But the cold was not simply an obstacle to be endured, it was a challenge to be conquered. The Vikings had long understood that in nature, every challenge presented an opportunity, and every weakness had a solution if one had the wit and the drive to find it. They saw the winter as a test, one that could either break them or shape them into something greater. They knew that survival depended not only on finding food or shelter but on creating a safe haven from the cold itself. The winter months were a time of constant trial, where every day was a fight against the elements, but also an opportunity to prove their mettle. Their survival wasn't just about fortitude, it was about creating an environment where they could live, not just exist. The Viking longhouses, sturdy and well-crafted, became havens from the merciless cold. These structures, carefully designed with thick walls and slanted roofs to shed the weight of the snow, provided more than just shelter from the elements. They provided warmth. They provided community. They provided a sense of security that allowed the Vikings to rest, to recharge, and to prepare for the next trial. But even the longhouses were not enough to guarantee survival on their own. The Vikings had to find ways to stay warm during the long nights, to protect themselves from the frostbite that could kill them in hours, and to keep their food stores from freezing. These were not just practical concerns. They were matters of life and death. The cold had the power to undo everything they had worked for, and in this constant battle, the Vikings learned to rely on one another. In these harsh conditions, their sense of community grew ever stronger, for survival was never a solo endeavor, it was a collective effort. Imagine the Vikings huddled around their fires, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls of their homes. Outside, the wind would shriek and moan, but inside, the warmth of the hearth would offer a brief respite from the unyielding cold. As the fire crackled and the smoke rose up the chimney, the Vikings would settle in for the long winter night, knowing that survival was never a given, but a privilege earned through resilience, resourcefulness, and unity. Yet, no matter how strong or resilient they were, the Viking people were still at the mercy of winter's harsh demands. The cold didn't care how skilled they were, how much they had learned from their ancestors, or how hard they worked to stay warm. It was an equalizer, an implacable force that could break the spirit of the unprepared. The Vikings knew that winter was not a simple adversary, it was an eternal challenge, one that would never relent. The cold would always come, but so would their ability to fight back. Through every cold snap, every frostbitten finger, every sleepless night spent huddled together in the dim glow of a fire, the Vikings endured. Their strength, their resilience, their unity, all became defined by their struggle against the bitter cold. But perhaps it was not just the physical cold they fought against, but something deeper, something existential. The Vikings were not simply trying to survive, they were trying to prove that they could overcome the most brutal of winters, that they could stand strong against the forces of nature, and that they could thrive where others might falter. And so, as the cold winds swept across the land, and the dark nights stretched endlessly ahead, the Vikings endured. They adapted. They innovated. They built their shelters, their fires, and their communities to withstand the chill. For them, the winter was not just a season, it was a challenge, one that they met head-on with everything they had. Through it all, they proved that no matter how harsh the cold, the Viking spirit would never be extinguished. As the days began to shorten, a foreboding silence descended upon the Viking lands. The sun, once a trusted companion, seemed to disappear behind a veil of cloud and snow. The world, once bathed in the warmth of daylight, now stood under a cold, heavy cloak of darkness. In the north, this transition wasn't a fleeting shift, it was an all-encompassing change. The Vikings lived in a world where the night wasn't just the absence of light, it was the very fabric of their existence, the shadow that stretched far beyond the horizon, touching everything in its path. Winter for the Vikings wasn't simply about cold winds and heavy snow, it was about the relentless darkness that gripped the land. Imagine waking up in the deep of winter to a sky that barely hints at the dawn, a pale, distant glow hanging at the horizon, offering little hope of warmth. 4 months on end, daylight would seem like a distant memory, and what little light there was only deepened the sense of isolation and despair. As the sun barely peeped above the horizon, it was as if the world itself held its breath, as though waiting for the first spark of light to chase away the endless blackness. But it wouldn't come. Instead, the long polar nights would settle in with a weight that pressed against every building, every tree, every person. The Vikings, no strangers to hardship, now faced a different kind of challenge, one that was psychological as much as it was physical. In a world of perpetual night, time itself seemed to lose meaning. The hours blended into one another, indistinguishable from the darkness. Sleep and wakefulness merged, and the days that once marked the rhythms of life now felt like a blur. There was no bright morning sun to signal a new day, no golden hour to indicate that evening was approaching. In this endless night, all was shrouded in shadow. The world was reduced to a series of blurred moments, where each second seemed stretched, distorted, and drawn out into infinity. The Vikings, strong and steadfast as they were not immune to the weight of this darkness. It seeped into their minds, creeping into the edges of their thoughts. They were a people built on action, warriors, explorers, traders, whose lives had always been measured by movement, by the pursuit of something, be it land, fortune, or knowledge. But now, in the dead of winter, the very essence of their existence seemed suspended in the heavy silence of the long nights. The darkness was more than just a visual absence. It was an emotional and psychological challenge. Without the light of day, the Vikings' sense of time began to warp. There was no clear distinction between night and day. With the absence of sunlight, it was easy to lose track of when one hour ended and another began. The cycles of life that governed their world, feeding, working, and resting, became distorted. Without the sun's guidance, there was a constant sense of uncertainty, as if the very fabric of reality was slipping through their fingers. It was in these long, dark months that the true test of survival was not just physical, but mental. The isolation began to feel suffocating. The Vikings, known for their fearless spirit, now found themselves battling the most primal fear, the fear of the unknown. The dark was a place where monsters and myths lived, where shadows seemed to whisper and move just out of sight. In a landscape where the snow and ice transformed everything into something unrecognizable, it was easy to imagine the world as an alien, hostile place. And yet, the Vikings persisted. Their homes, longhouses built with thick wood and turf, became not just shelters from the cold but sanctuaries from the overwhelming darkness. Inside the longhouse, where the warmth of the fire glowed and flickered, there was a sense of community, of shared humanity. The hearths burned bright with light, not only providing warmth but becoming the heart of the home, a beacon in the endless night. The light from the fire would push back the shadows, offering a small sense of security in a world that felt otherwise endless and unyielding. But even inside these sturdy shelters, the darkness loomed. The Vikings couldn't escape the fact that the days would remain shorter and colder than they could ever have hoped for. The isolation of winter hung heavily, and it was easy to fall into the quiet despair that crept in when you could barely distinguish the days from the nights. Even the most seasoned warriors, the strongest of their people, would have their resolve tested in these long, cold, dark months. In the midst of this darkness, the Vikings would find themselves relying more and more on their traditions, their community, and their inner strength. Their stories became a form of resistance, a way to push back against the encroaching shadows, to fill the long, silent nights with something more than just the cold and the dark. Stories of gods, heroes, and great battles were passed down around the fires, where the flickering flames illuminated the faces of those gathered, keeping their spirits alive. These tales would give the Vikings something to hold on to when everything else seemed distant and far away. But even with these communal rituals, the weight of the endless night was a heavy burden to bear. The sun, barely making its way across the horizon, seemed indifferent to the Vikings' plight. There was no mercy from the heavens, the cold didn't relent, and the darkness showed no sign of breaking. For months, the Vikings would find themselves living in the liminal space between light and shadow, a place where hope and despair seemed to dance just out of reach. Despite their resilience, the darkness could not be outrun. It was a presence, a force that pressed against every Viking home, every longhouse, every heart. It was a reminder of the forces of nature that the Vikings had to reckon with, forces they could not control, but only endure. And yet, through it all, they carried on, driven by an unyielding need to survive. In these endless, cold nights, the Vikings learned to adapt. They learned how to navigate by the stars, how to prepare for the long, dark months, and how to keep the fires burning. They turned to each other for strength, for companionship, and for stories that would keep them from succumbing to the weight of the night. The darkness, though oppressive and vast, could not extinguish the fire of their will. The longer the night stretched, the stronger their resolve became. The long polar nights became not just a challenge to survive, but a challenge to endure, to persist. The Vikings came to see them not as a burden to bear, but as a test of their spirit, a test they would continue to pass over and over again. For in the face of the overwhelming darkness, they would always find a way to light their way forward. The Vikings are often remembered for their fierceness in battle, their mastery of the sea, and their relentless raids across distant lands. But beyond the sword and shield, there was something deeper at the heart of their identity, a spirit that was forged in the crucible of nature's harshest trials. This spirit was not one of mere survival, but of an unyielding will to endure, to thrive, and to leave an indelible mark on the world. In the face of darkness and cold that could freeze the bones, the Vikings found their strength not just in their bodies, but in their hearts, minds, and souls. The Viking drive to endure was born not in the comforts of a well-tended hearth or the security of fertile lands, but in the raw, unforgiving landscapes of the north. The very environment they inhabited seemed designed to test their resolve at every turn. The winters were long, the nights endless, and the threats constant, from the bitter cold to the dangerous creatures that roamed the forests. And yet, the Vikings were not just survivors of this hostile world. They were its masters, its conquerors. They had learned to not only live with nature, but to work alongside it, to use its harshness to their advantage. At the core of the Viking spirit was a fierce sense of independence. For the Vikings, life was not handed to them. It had to be seized, fought for, and earned. They were raised with the understanding that the world would not care for them. The cold would not retreat simply because they begged it to. The nights would not grow shorter just because they wished for daylight. Everything they achieved, everything they earned, came from their own efforts. This awareness of life's inherent struggle became the foundation of their resilience. The Viking way of life was built around this relentless pursuit of endurance. As children, they were taught not just how to wield a sword, but how to persevere through hardship. They learned to handle the cold, to endure the long, dark months with grit and determination. As they grew, the teachings became more practical: how to build shelters that would withstand the fierce storms, how to hunt and fish in frozen waters, how to grow food in soil that rarely thawed. But it wasn't just about the physical skills. It was about the mentality that shaped their approach to every challenge. From a young age, the Vikings were instilled with the understanding that their personal strength was only part of the equation. The true test of their ability to endure came from their capacity to work together. In the long, dark winters, where isolation could drive even the strongest minds to madness, the Vikings relied on each other to survive. Their bonds were forged in the fire of shared struggle and sacrifice. It was not enough for one person to survive. The community had to survive together. They built their longhouses to house not just families, but entire communities, with each member playing a vital role in the survival of the whole. The act of enduring, then, was not a solitary one. It was a collective effort. When the cold winds blew, and the darkness stretched on for weeks, the Vikings gathered in the warmth of their longhouses, sharing food, stories, and work. The fire at the center of the room was more than just a source of warmth. It was a symbol of the communal strength that bound them together. Each person contributed to the effort, whether by chopping wood, preparing meals, or keeping watch during the long nights. There was no room for weakness or selfishness. The Vikings understood that their strength came from their unity, from their willingness to endure together, side by side. In the heart of winter, when the landscape outside was reduced to a world of ice and snow, the longhouse became a sanctuary. It was a place of safety and warmth, but also of mutual support. The Viking spirit was embodied in these shared moments: the hushed conversations around the fire, the communal meals, the stories passed down from generation to generation. Through these traditions, the Vikings learned how to keep their spirits high, how to fend off the crushing weight of the cold and the darkness. These were not just practical strategies for survival. They were emotional lifelines that allowed the Vikings to endure mentally and spiritually. But the Viking spirit was not just about surviving the elements. It was about thriving in spite of them. The desire to endure wasn't rooted in simple survival instinct, but in a deeper drive to push the boundaries of what was possible. This drive manifested itself not only in their ability to adapt to the extreme conditions of the north, but in their relentless exploration of new lands. The Vikings were not content to simply survive in their homeland. They ventured beyond, seeking out new territories, new opportunities, and new challenges. The same spirit that allowed them to endure the harsh winters also propelled them to set sail across treacherous seas, to raid distant shores, and to establish kingdoms far from home. There was something deeply ingrained in the Viking psyche that saw adversity as an opportunity. The darkness of winter, the cold of the north, the isolation of their world. These were not obstacles to be avoided, but challenges to be embraced. The Viking way was to confront difficulties head-on, to turn them into advantages, to find solutions where others saw only problems. They knew that the winter could break the weak, but it could also forge the strong. Their endurance was not just physical, it was a mentality that permeated every aspect of their lives. It was the knowledge that nothing in life would come easily, and that every victory, every conquest, every achievement, was earned through struggle. This mentality was passed down from generation to generation, becoming a part of the Viking identity. The idea of enduring hardship was so deeply ingrained in their culture that it became something to be proud of, a mark of strength, resilience, and honor. In the face of overwhelming odds, the Vikings remained unbowed. The long nights, the fierce cold, and the isolation only served to strengthen their resolve. They knew that survival wasn't a matter of chance, it was a matter of will. Their will to endure was what defined them, what set them apart from others. While the world around them seemed to freeze and falter, the Vikings pushed forward, finding ways to adapt, to innovate, and to survive. It wasn't just the physical act of enduring the winter that defined the Viking spirit, it was the mental fortitude to face the unknown, to confront the challenges of nature and life with courage and determination. The Vikings understood that the true measure of a person wasn't how they lived during times of peace and plenty, but how they faced the trials of winter, the hardships of isolation, and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that life threw their way. It was in these moments of struggle that the Viking spirit shone brightest, proving that it was not the cold that could break them, but their unbreakable will to endure. The Longhouse was not just a building, it was the heart of Viking life. It was where families and communities came together to weather the storms of winter, both literal and metaphorical. In a world where the elements could be as deadly as any enemy, the Viking Longhouse was a sanctuary, a place of refuge from the unrelenting cold and darkness. To the Vikings, the Longhouse was a symbol of survival, one that offered more than just shelter from the harsh winters. It offered warmth, safety, and a sense of unity that was essential to their way of life. Imagine stepping inside a Viking longhouse during a fierce winter storm. The wind howls outside, the cold biting at anything exposed to it, but within these thick wooden walls, warmth and light radiate from the central hearth, where the fire crackles and hisses as it burns. The scent of wood smoke fills the air, and the warmth from the fire reaches every corner of the space. The roof, covered in turf and grass, keeps the worst of the cold and snow at bay, while the thick wooden walls stand firm against the fierce winds. Here, inside the longhouse, the world outside feels like a distant memory, one of danger and fear, while inside is safety and security. The Viking longhouse was a remarkable structure, designed not just for protection but for community. These long, narrow buildings could stretch up to 70 feet or more in length and were typically divided into different sections for various purposes, including living space, storage, and areas for livestock. But no matter how the space was divided, the central feature of the longhouse was always the hearth. This hearth was the beating heart of the home, and its warmth provided life in the harshest of winters. It was where families gathered to cook, to talk, to tell stories, and to bond. The fire itself was more than just a source of heat, it was the center of Viking social life. In the darkness of winter, when the nights were long and the sun barely rose above the horizon, the hearth became a place of solace. The Vikings would gather around the fire in the evenings, sharing food and drink, and engaging in conversations that would pass down their history, myths, and legends. It was around these fires that the Viking sagas were born, tales of gods and heroes that kept the spirit of the people alive even in the darkest of times. The fire, both literal and symbolic, was a source of life, warmth, and strength, offering a refuge from the crushing cold outside. The longhouse was more than just a physical shelter, it was a social hub. Families didn't just live together in these spaces, they thrived together. The longhouse was a place where bonds were forged in the crucible of shared survival. It wasn't uncommon for extended families, clans, or even whole communities to live in a single longhouse, all contributing to the work of maintaining the shelter, gathering food, and sharing in the collective efforts to stay warm and fed during the long winter months. This sense of communal living created a bond between people that went beyond the superficial. The Vikings understood that to survive in their harsh world, they had to rely on one another. The longhouse was the physical manifestation of this principle, a space where everyone, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, worked together to endure. The design of the longhouse itself was an ingenious response to the harsh conditions of the north. The walls, made of timber and sometimes stone, were thick and strong, able to withstand the battering winds and heavy snowfall that often came with Viking winters. The roof, covered with layers of sod and turf, provided insulation, keeping the warmth of the fire inside while blocking out the biting cold. The slanted roof also helped to prevent the buildup of snow, which could collapse the structure if left unchecked. The Vikings knew that their shelter had to be strong and resilient, just as they were. Every design choice in the longhouse was made with survival in mind, from the shape of the building to the materials used. Inside, the longhouse was typically divided into two main sections. The central area, closest to the hearth, was where the family would spend most of their time, gathering around the fire, cooking meals, and resting. This space was communal, with no separation between rooms or individual quarters. It was a place of shared warmth and comfort, where the cold and dark of the outside world were kept at bay by the strength of the hearth and the people gathered around it. The outer parts of the longhouse were used for storage, tools, and sometimes even animals. In the Viking world, survival often depended on having enough food and supplies to last through the long, cold months of winter. The longhouse provided a safe space to store dried meats, grains, and other essentials. In some cases, livestock such as goats or chickens might be kept inside as well, protected from the freezing cold of the outside world. This clever design ensured that the Vikings had easy access to food and supplies without needing to venture out into the freezing winter air. But the longhouse wasn't just a shelter from the cold, it was also a fortress. In a world where raids, invasions, and warfare were constant threats, the longhouse offered protection from enemies as well as from the elements. The thick walls and sturdy construction made the longhouse a formidable defense against intruders, while the communal nature of the space meant that everyone could contribute to defending it. The Vikings, known for their seafaring and raiding prowess, understood the importance of securing their homes and families from harm. The longhouse, with its sturdy walls and central hearth, was both a symbol of warmth and security and a reminder of the vigilance required to protect what was theirs. Living in such close quarters during the long, dark months of winter also brought with it its own set of challenges. The space was cramped, and privacy was a rare luxury. Yet, this was another aspect of Viking life that demanded resilience. The Vikings were a people who understood the importance of community, living together, working together, and surviving together. The shared struggle of surviving the winter created bonds that went deeper than mere kinship. The longhouse was a place where personal differences were set aside for the greater good, where the needs of the group took precedence over the needs of the individual. The Viking longhouse, then, was not just a physical structure, it was a way of life. It was a place of warmth, safety, and unity, but also of strength and resilience. It was a space where the Vikings could endure the harshness of winter, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. In the heart of the longhouse, where the fire burned brightly and the stories flowed freely, the Vikings found the strength to face the darkness outside. The longhouse was their refuge, their shield against the cold, their community in the face of isolation, and their symbol of survival in a world that offered little mercy. Viking shelters were not just places to rest their heads, they were masterpieces of craftsmanship, born from necessity, shaped by nature, and perfected through generations of trial and error. In a world where winter could stretch on for months, where the cold could seep into every corner of life, the Vikings had to build their homes with a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere shelter. They needed spaces that could withstand the brutal cold, the biting winds, and the weight of the endless snow. But they also needed homes that could keep them warm, that could protect their families and their communities from the forces of nature that seemed intent on overpowering them. The construction of Viking homes, most notably the longhouse, was a careful balance between strength, practicality, and resilience. These shelters were designed to meet the demands of an unforgiving environment, and every detail, from the layout of the space to the materials used, was chosen with survival in mind. The cold of the north was a constant adversary, but the Vikings were not helpless in the face of it. They adapted, innovated, and built structures that could endure the harshest winters, providing not just physical protection but a sense of security and warmth that allowed them to continue living in one of the most inhospitable parts of the world. To understand Viking craftsmanship, one must first consider the materials available to them. Wood, stone, and earth were the primary resources they had to work with, each chosen for its durability and effectiveness in withstanding the cold. In the dense forests of Scandinavia, wood was abundant, and the Vikings were expert woodworkers, using it not only for the walls and frames of their longhouses but also for the roofs and floors. Timber was carefully selected, seasoned, and cut to fit the specific needs of the structure. Wood was used to create sturdy frames, beams, and supports that could bear the weight of the roof, the snow, and the elements. The Viking longhouse was built to withstand not just the cold but the constant pressure of snow and ice. The roofs, often steeply sloped, were designed to allow snow to slide off, preventing the dangerous buildup that could collapse the entire structure. The materials used for the roof were just as carefully chosen. The Vikings covered their roofs with turf, a material that provided insulation against the freezing cold. Turf, made from layers of grass, soil, and roots, acted as a natural insulator, trapping heat inside and keeping the cold from seeping in. In fact, the Viking roof was one of the most important features of their shelters. It kept the warmth of the fire inside and protected the inhabitants from the snow, rain, and wind outside. In the colder months, when the temperature would plunge below freezing, the insulating properties of the turf roof became even more crucial. The Vikings understood that the warmth inside their homes depended not only on the fire in the hearth but on the way heat was trapped within the structure. The thick wooden walls, often made from logs stacked tightly together, provided a strong barrier against the cold. The wood was treated with care, sealed with clay, pitch, or moss to prevent drafts and reduce heat loss. The walls were sometimes lined with animal skins, which provided additional warmth and insulation. But the craftsmanship of Viking shelters went beyond just the physical materials. It was about understanding how to use the landscape to their advantage. Vikings were experts in reading the land, knowing which materials would best withstand the conditions they faced. They knew that building their homes in places with natural protection, such as near hills or dense forests, could provide a buffer against the winds that howled across the open plains. They used the land's natural topography to shelter their homes from the worst of the weather, often building in areas that offered some form of windbreak or protection from the harshest elements. The construction of Viking homes was a communal effort. These were not structures that could be built by one person alone. The work was divided among skilled craftsmen, laborers, and entire families, each contributing to the construction process. A Viking longhouse was a symbol of cooperation, each person playing a role in creating the shelter that would protect them from the winter. The walls and roof were raised with the help of the community, with each log and beam placed with careful precision to ensure the building could withstand the weight of the snow and the power of the wind. Inside, the craftsmanship was just as important. The floor of the longhouse was typically made of packed earth or gravel, often covered with straw, moss, or animal hides to provide warmth and comfort. This flooring helped insulate the shelter, preventing the cold from rising up from the ground. The hearth, the heart of the longhouse, was built with care, constructed from stone or clay to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading. The chimney, which vented smoke out of the house, was another marvel of Viking engineering. The smoke was directed through a flue, usually built of stone or brick, that carried the fumes away from the living space, ensuring that the air inside the home remained breathable. The Vikings didn't just build their homes to survive the elements. They built them to thrive within them. They understood that their shelters had to be more than just structures. They had to be refuges, places of warmth and safety in the midst of a brutal and unforgiving winter. The longhouse was a space where the family or community could come together, share food and stories, and find comfort in the harshest of conditions. It wasn't just the physical construction of the shelter that mattered. It was the emotional and social fabric of the home that made it so essential to Viking life. The role of the longhouse in Viking society was also about identity. These were not just homes. They were places where people gathered to celebrate their culture, where traditions were passed down through generations, and where the spirit of the Viking people was kept alive. The craftsmanship of their homes reflected the ingenuity and resilience of the Vikings themselves. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, their ability to craft shelters that could withstand the forces of nature was a testament to their resourcefulness and determination. Even as they ventured out into the world, raiding and trading across distant lands, the Vikings carried the knowledge of how to build these shelters with them. Their longhouses were the foundation of their existence, not just in Scandinavia, but in every land they touched. Whether they were in the frozen north or the far reaches of the Mediterranean, the Viking longhouse was a symbol of their strength and adaptability. Through their craftsmanship, the Vikings proved that they could not only survive in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, but they could thrive. Their homes, built with precision and care, provided more than just protection from the cold. They were a testament to the ingenuity of a people who understood that to endure the harshest winters, one must build not just for survival but for life. The Viking way of life was not built on comfort or ease. It was forged in the harshest of conditions, shaped by the bitter cold of their homeland. In a land where winter stretched for months, where the days were short and the nights seemed endless, the Vikings had no choice but to adapt. They did not have the luxury of waiting for the weather to change or hoping for milder conditions. To survive, they had to embrace the cold, work with it, and turn it from an adversary into a tool for their survival. Surviving the brutal winters of Scandinavia was not just a matter of building sturdy shelters, it was about a lifestyle that revolved around the rhythms of the seasons. The Vikings understood the cycles of nature and built their lives around the demands of the cold. Their daily routines were shaped by the need to conserve heat, to preserve food, and to make the most of the fleeting moments of daylight that winter allowed. One of the most important aspects of Viking life during the long winters was their ability to stay warm. With little sunlight to speak of, the Vikings relied on fire not only to cook and light their homes, but to keep their bodies warm. The hearth was the center of the Viking longhouse, where families gathered to eat, talk, and share stories. The fire was their lifeline, providing heat in the freezing cold and a space to come together as a community. The warmth of the fire extended beyond its physical heat. It was a beacon of comfort, security, and survival in the face of the cold. In addition to the central hearth, the Vikings were careful about how they used their limited heat. The longhouses were designed to maximize the efficiency of the fire. Thick, insulated walls trapped the heat inside, and the roofs were built to keep the cold out while allowing the smoke from the fire to escape. The Vikings knew that heat, once lost, was difficult to regain. They used every available tool and technique to ensure that the warmth of the fire would last throughout the long winter nights. But staying warm was not just about the structures they built, it was also about how they dressed. The Vikings had an intimate understanding of their environment, and they knew how to adapt their clothing to survive the cold. Their clothes were made from the hides of animals they hunted, the wool of sheep they raised, and the furs of creatures that roamed the frozen land. Layers were key to their survival. Thick woolen garments provided insulation, while fur-lined cloaks and hats kept the wind at bay. The Vikings also wore boots made from animal skins, lined with fur, which helped them keep their feet dry and warm in the snow and ice. When they ventured outdoors, their clothing was not just practical. It was also designed to protect them from the physical toll the cold could take. Frostbite was a real danger in the winter months, and the Vikings knew that exposure to the elements could mean death. They dressed in layers, with the outer garments designed to shield them from the wind, while the inner layers trapped heat and moisture close to the body. The use of animal hides, which had been tanned and worked with incredible skill, allowed the Vikings to wear clothing that was not only functional but durable, able to withstand the harsh conditions of the north. Food preservation was another area where the Vikings showed extraordinary resourcefulness. In the winter, when fresh food was scarce and the days were too short to hunt effectively, they had to rely on stored food to see them through the cold months. The Vikings were skilled at preserving meat and fish through drying, smoking, and salting. The longhouses had storage areas where dried meats, fish, and vegetables were kept for the winter. This preserved food became essential to their survival, as it allowed them to maintain their strength and energy during the months when hunting and farming were not viable. But it wasn't just meat that they preserved, they also developed ingenious ways to store and cook food that would last through the cold. In the long winter months, the Vikings would often rely on stews and soups, made from dried meats, salted fish, and root vegetables. These hearty dishes not only provided necessary nutrients but also helped them conserve their energy by keeping them warm from the inside. Food was often cooked in large pots over the fire, where it could be eaten in communal gatherings, ensuring that no one went hungry. The Vikings also understood the importance of community in the face of such adversity. Winter, with its isolation and bleakness, could easily break the spirits of the unprepared. The Vikings, however, drew strength from each other. Their survival wasn't just a matter of personal resilience, it was about the collective effort to endure. The Longhouse, with its communal fire and shared spaces, was a hub of activity. Families, neighbors, and even distant relatives came together to help one another during the harsh months. Whether it was working together to repair shelters, sharing food, or simply offering companionship during the long, dark nights, the Vikings knew that survival depended on the strength of their bonds. Even the most experienced Vikings could be worn down by the cold and the isolation. It was easy to become discouraged in the face of endless nights, constant darkness, and the oppressive cold that seemed to permeate everything. But the Vikings had a deep connection to their heritage and their traditions, which helped them stay focused and determined. They knew that their ancestors had faced similar hardships and had overcome them through ingenuity, courage, and strength. They carried this legacy with them in their daily lives, constantly striving to uphold the values of their people. Life in the Viking world during the winter was not just about surviving, it was about living through the winter with strength and honor. The harsh cold tested the mettle of the Vikings, but it also made them stronger. They learned to find joy in the small things, whether it was a warm meal shared around the fire or the telling of stories that helped them forget, for a moment, the bitterness of the winter night. The cold, while a constant challenge, also created opportunities for the Vikings to demonstrate their endurance, their resourcefulness, and their resilience. It was this ability to adapt, to endure, and to thrive in the harshest of conditions that defined the Viking people. The cold and the darkness were not their enemies. They were part of the landscape, part of the world they inhabited. The Vikings understood that to survive, they needed to work with the environment, not against it. They learned to read the signs of nature, to use their surroundings to their advantage, and to build lives that were as strong and enduring as the very land they lived on. In the face of endless winter, the Vikings stood firm, not just surviving, but thriving, one cold, dark night at a time. For the Vikings, winter was not a season to be feared or avoided, it was a challenge to be met head-on. The cold months of the northern winters tested every aspect of their being, physically, mentally, and emotionally. To thrive in the harsh environment, they didn't rely on luck or hope. Instead, they honed their survival skills through generations of ingenuity and adaptation. The Vikings knew that the cold was unrelenting, but they understood that with the right knowledge, tools, and mindset, they could turn it into an advantage. The landscapes in which the Vikings lived were tough, untamed, and unforgiving. The air bit at their skin, and the ground was often covered in layers of ice and snow. Yet, the Vikings were not daunted by these conditions. They embraced them, shaping their way of life to fit the rhythm of the seasons. Every winter was an opportunity to prove their endurance, to refine their resourcefulness, and to pass down vital knowledge that would allow them to survive and even flourish despite the most challenging of circumstances. One of the Vikings' most vital tools for survival during winter was their understanding of the natural world. Living in such a harsh environment demanded an intimate connection with the land, the weather, and the animals that shared their world. The Vikings were keen observers of nature. They knew how to read the sky for signs of weather changes, how to interpret the behavior of animals as signals of coming storms or shifts in temperature. This relationship with nature allowed the Vikings to prepare for the inevitable hardships of winter with foresight and skill. They knew when to gather firewood in preparation for the cold months ahead, carefully selecting the best types of wood that would burn the longest and hottest. The Vikings used a variety of tree species for their fires, from oak for its dense, slow-burning properties to birch, which burned quickly but with a bright, hot flame. Woodcutting was a skill passed down through generations, as important as hunting or farming. The ability to secure and store enough firewood to last through the winter was a key to survival. The Vikings also used their knowledge of the forest to gather other materials that would help them get through the cold months: moss for insulation, birch bark for crafting, and even various herbs that would preserve food or act as medicine during the long winter. Food preservation was another essential skill for winter survival. The Vikings understood that fresh food was a luxury during the winter months, so they developed sophisticated techniques to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables. Smoking, salting, and drying were the primary methods of preservation. Fish were caught in the summer months, dried and salted, then stored in cool, dry places to ensure they would last through the winter. Meat was treated in much the same way. Sheep, goats, and cattle were slaughtered in the autumn, and the meat was either salted or smoked to extend its shelf life. Vikings even knew how to preserve fruits and vegetables, drying them or pickling them to ensure they had access to vital nutrients throughout the winter. But survival in the winter months was not just about storing and conserving, it was also about ingenuity in utilizing available resources. Vikings were expert craftsmen who could make the most out of what they had, often repurposing materials to suit their needs. They knew how to create functional tools, clothing, and shelter from what nature provided. For instance, they crafted their clothing from wool, fur, and leather, using animal pelts not only for warmth but also for their durability. The skins of reindeer, bears, and wolves, as well as the softer pelts of foxes and rabbits, were turned into garments designed to protect against the biting cold. Woolen garments were lined with fur, creating layers of insulation that would trap heat close to the body. Boots made of animal hides and fur were fashioned to withstand snow and ice, keeping their feet warm and dry in the harshest conditions. The Viking longhouse, as mentioned previously, was another brilliant example of their ingenuity. It was designed to conserve heat and protect its inhabitants from the cold. But the Vikings did not just rely on the physical structure of their homes. They also devised methods to control the temperature within. The design of the hearth was particularly crucial. The fire was placed in a central location, with stone or clay walls around it to maximize heat retention. Vikings also used strategically placed vents and flues to direct smoke and keep the indoor air breathable. In the dead of winter, the longhouse became a sanctuary of warmth, where families huddled together, drawing comfort and strength from the fire that crackled in the center. The Vikings also found ingenious ways to stay active and continue providing for themselves throughout the winter months. Hunting and fishing were still possible, though more difficult, and required specific techniques suited to the season. Ice fishing, for example, was a method used to catch fish from frozen lakes and rivers. The Vikings would cut holes in the ice and lower lines or nets, using bait to attract fish during the cold months. They would also hunt animals such as reindeer, elk, and even wild boar. The snow-covered landscape, though daunting, provided its own set of opportunities. The Vikings were skilled at tracking animals through the snow, reading the subtle signs left by their movements and learning to use this information to their advantage. These hunting skills were not just about acquiring food, they were vital for maintaining the Viking identity as hunters and warriors, individuals in tune with the land and its rhythms. Even in the harshest of winters, the Vikings knew that survival was not just about focusing solely on their immediate needs, it was about planning for the future. They took every opportunity to ensure that they had enough to last not only through the current winter but also for the months ahead. The Vikings used the winter to prepare for the coming seasons. They planted winter crops like barley and oats that would grow during the warmer months, and they continued to gather supplies for their boats and voyages, making sure their equipment was maintained and ready for the inevitable raids and exploration. Despite the cold and isolation, the Vikings were always looking toward the future, never simply content with surviving day by day. This forward-thinking mindset is what made them such powerful and successful people. Their ability to turn the harshest conditions into a challenge they could meet, to learn from each winter and adapt for the next, was the secret to their long-term survival and prosperity. Winter, for the Vikings, was not something to endure passively. It was something they confronted head-on with every ounce of their ingenuity and resourcefulness. In the end, it was their ability to adapt to the cold and to the world around them that made the Vikings so formidable. They did not simply survive winter, they thrived in it. They learned to use the cold to their advantage, turning the seemingly oppressive environment into a crucible in which their strength, skills, and resilience were forged. The bitter cold, the endless nights, and the weight of the snow only fueled their drive to endure, adapt, and conquer. For the Vikings, winter was not a season of weakness, but one of unyielding strength and innovation. In the heart of the Viking longhouse, When the cold winds howled outside and the snow piled up against the wooden walls, there was one thing that kept the spirits of the people alive: the warmth of stories. The long winter nights, when daylight barely made an appearance and the darkness seemed endless, could be crushing. But for the Vikings, these nights were not a time of despair. Instead, they were an opportunity to gather around the fire and share tales, stories of gods, heroes, and the distant lands their ancestors had traveled. Storytelling, for the Vikings, was more than just entertainment. It was a powerful tool for survival, a way to keep their spirits strong and their cultural identity intact in the face of hardship. The Viking longhouse was a place where the physical cold could be battled with the warmth of fire and companionship, but it was also a space where the emotional and psychological coldness of isolation could be warded off with the power of stories. The hearth was the center of these gatherings, casting a soft, flickering light on the faces of the listeners. Here, family and community would sit together, sharing the warmth of the fire and the comfort of tales that transcended time and space. It was in this sacred space, where generations of Vikings had gathered, that the true power of storytelling was most felt. The stories themselves were woven into the very fabric of Viking culture. Norse mythology, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki, was central to their worldview. The gods were not just distant figures in the sky, they were part of the Vikings' everyday life, and their stories were told to explain the world around them. The Vikings believed that the gods influenced everything from the changing of the seasons to the fate of warriors in battle. The sagas, epic tales of battles and conquests, were filled with references to these deities, and they were told and retold in longhouse gatherings, ensuring that the connection to the divine remained ever present. These stories were not mere myths or fables, they were guides for life. The lessons embedded in the sagas taught the Vikings how to behave in the world. They learned from the heroic tales of mighty warriors, whose bravery and valor in battle were celebrated as ideals to strive for. They also learned from the trickster god Loki, whose cunning and mischief were both a source of wisdom and a warning. Every tale had its lesson, and every lesson was meant to shape the character and actions of the listener. In this way, the sagas were more than just a reflection of Viking beliefs. They were a tool for the moral and social education of the people. But storytelling also played an essential role in preserving Viking history. In a society that had no written language for much of its history, oral storytelling was the primary method for passing down knowledge. The Vikings understood the importance of remembering their past, not only for the sake of tradition but for the survival of their identity. The longhouse became a living archive, where every tale of conquest, discovery, and struggle was recorded in the memories of those who heard it. The sagas were passed down from generation to generation, with each storyteller adding their own flavor and perspective to the narrative. Over time, these stories grew into an intricate web of history and myth, binding the Viking people together across time and space. The importance of storytelling in Viking culture was further underscored by the role of the skalds, the poets and bards who were responsible for crafting and performing these tales. Skalds were not only artists but were also highly respected members of Viking society. They had the power to shape history with their words, immortalizing the deeds of kings, warriors, and gods. Their ability to weave words into compelling narratives made them crucial to maintaining the collective memory of the Viking people. It was the skalds who would recite the great sagas in front of the fire, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the tale, bringing to life the deeds of their ancestors and inspiring those who listened. For the Vikings, storytelling was a way of asserting their identity in a world that was constantly changing. They faced threats from outside forces, the Christianization of Scandinavia, the rise of rival kingdoms, and the expanding influence of foreign powers. The Vikings were in many ways a people defined by their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to overcome. But at the same time, they were a people deeply connected to their heritage. The sagas, passed down by the skalds and shared around the hearth, kept that heritage alive, reminding the Vikings of their roots and their proud warrior traditions. When they faced uncertainty or hardship, they could turn to these stories for strength and guidance. The legends of their ancestors, who had once braved the seas and conquered foreign lands, served as a source of inspiration for those who came after them. The power of storytelling also had a deeply emotional and psychological effect on the Vikings. Life in the harsh Scandinavian landscape was not easy. The winters were long and isolating, and the threat of famine, disease, and war was ever present. Yet, in the midst of these challenges, the Vikings found solace in the stories they shared. These tales provided an emotional anchor, reminding them of their resilience and their place in a larger, timeless narrative. The stories gave them hope, purpose, and a sense of continuity. They were reminded that they were not alone, that they were part of something greater than themselves. On a more personal level, storytelling was a way for individuals to process their own experiences. The Vikings had a unique understanding of fate, or WRD, the belief that the course of a person's life was often determined by forces beyond their control. However, through storytelling, they could shape their own narratives, weaving their actions into the broader tapestry of Viking legend. The sagas allowed them to take ownership of their lives and to find meaning in their struggles. Whether in times of triumph or tragedy, the Viking warrior could find a parallel in the stories of the gods or the heroes of old, drawing strength from their examples. Moreover, storytelling was a social glue that bound the community together. It was not just a solitary activity but a communal one. The Longhouse was a place where stories were shared, and listeners became participants in the narrative. In this way, storytelling was an act of unity, an affirmation of collective identity. Whether told by a skald, an elder, or a child, each story added to the collective memory of the group, strengthening the bonds of kinship and community. The fireside gatherings were where personal and collective histories converged, where individuals could share their dreams, their fears, and their triumphs, and be reminded that they were part of a larger story. Even in the darkest moments of winter, when the cold seemed unbearable and the days stretched on endlessly, the Viking people found light in the warmth of the fire and the power of stories. These stories transcended the harsh realities of their world, offering a refuge from the biting cold and the isolation of the northern winters. They were a source of strength, courage, and connection, reminding the Vikings that, no matter how difficult the present might be, they were part of a larger story that had endured for generations and would continue long into the future. For the Vikings, the cold winters were not just a time of survival, they were a time for remembering, for reflecting, and for passing on the stories that would define them. Through the power of storytelling, they found warmth in the depths of winter and strength to face the challenges that lay ahead. The sagas were not just tales of gods and heroes, they were the very heartbeat of Viking culture, keeping the spirit of the people alive through the darkest months of the year. While the Vikings are often remembered for their fearsome raids and legendary warriors, they were also exceptional sailors and navigators, uniquely adapted to their harsh and demanding environment. The Viking longship, a masterpiece of design and engineering, was the key to their survival in a world dominated by cold seas, icy waters, and unpredictable weather. These ships allowed the Vikings to venture far beyond the fjords of Scandinavia, across the North Atlantic, into the waters of the Mediterranean, and all the way to the shores of North America, centuries before many other cultures. The Viking longship was not only a vessel for exploration and warfare, it was also a lifeline. The sea was the Vikings' natural environment, and their ability to navigate its vast and often dangerous expanse was central to their way of life. The icy seas were no less formidable than the brutal winters they faced on land, but the Vikings knew how to turn these challenges into opportunities. Their ships, with their sleek design, shallow drafts, and powerful sails, allowed them to travel long distances, trade with distant peoples, and launch raids with remarkable speed and efficiency. They understood the sea not just as a source of sustenance but as a path to adventure, opportunity, and wealth. At the heart of Viking exploration was the longship, a ship designed for both speed and agility. These vessels were long, narrow, and lightweight, built to navigate the shallow waters of the fjords, rivers, and coastlines of Scandinavia. The hulls were constructed from overlapping planks, a method known as clinker-built, which made the ships both flexible and strong, capable of withstanding the rough seas and harsh conditions they encountered. These ships were often around 60 to 100 feet long, with a sleek, low profile that made them fast and able to cut through the water with minimal resistance. The longship's design also allowed it to be easily propelled by both sails and oars. In open water, the sail would catch the wind, propelling the ship forward with remarkable speed. But when the wind was against them, or when they navigated through the narrower waters of rivers and fjords, the Vikings relied on the power of their rowers. The longships had a large crew of men who rowed in unison, propelling the vessel forward with great force. This combination of sail and oar made the longship a versatile and efficient vessel, capable of covering great distances in a short amount of time. One of the key innovations that allowed the Vikings to master the seas was their ability to navigate without relying on modern instruments or maps. Instead, they used a variety of natural signs to guide their way across the open water. The Vikings were skilled at reading the stars, the sun, and the landscape, using them as navigational tools. They relied heavily on the sun, which, when visible, provided a clear guide to direction. Viking sailors would use a sunstone, a special type of crystal, to help them determine the position of the sun, even when it was hidden behind clouds or fog, a vital tool during the often overcast and misty conditions of the North Atlantic. The Vikings also understood the tides and currents, and they used these to their advantage. They knew how the tides would change depending on the moon and the time of year, and they could predict how the currents would shift during their voyages. This knowledge allowed them to plan their routes carefully, avoiding dangerous areas and taking advantage of favorable conditions. By reading the ocean's natural rhythms, they could ensure that they made progress on their long voyages and that they reached their destination safely. The art of navigation was not just about reading the sky and the sea, it was about understanding the environment. The Vikings were keen observers of the weather and the changing seasons. They knew that the seas could be calm one day and treacherous the next, and they had to be prepared for both extremes. Their ships were built to withstand the harsh conditions of the northern waters, from violent storms to freezing temperatures. The longship's design, with its raised prow and stern, allowed it to cut through waves and survive in the roughest of seas. The sturdy oak hulls were treated with tar to protect against rot, while the sail could be quickly adjusted to deal with changing wind conditions. Even as they sailed into unfamiliar waters, the Vikings had a deep understanding of the land. They relied on landmarks, mountains, cliffs, or distinctive islands to help them navigate. When they sailed along the coast, they would keep their eyes peeled for familiar features, which would guide them to safe harbors or port towns. This knowledge of the land was passed down from generation to generation, and it was an essential part of Viking seamanship. Once the Vikings had mastered navigation in the cold northern seas, they were able to extend their reach far beyond the confines of Scandinavia. They began to sail westward, crossing the North Sea and venturing into the waters of the British Isles. From there, they moved southward, raiding and trading along the coasts of France, Spain, and even the Mediterranean. But it was their discovery and settlement of new lands that truly demonstrated the extent of their naval expertise. Perhaps the most remarkable of these voyages was that of Leif Erikson, who, around the year 1000, sailed to North America, reaching the shores of what is now Newfoundland in Canada. This was centuries before Christopher Columbus set foot in the Americas, and it was made possible by the Vikings' superior navigation skills. Leif and his crew sailed across the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, guided only by their knowledge of the stars, the currents, and the weather. They landed in what they called Vinland, a fertile and rich land that provided a new world for the Vikings to explore. Though the settlement did not last long, the journey itself remains a testament to the Vikings' remarkable maritime capabilities. The Viking longship was also a symbol of their strength and adaptability. As much a weapon as it was a mode of transportation, the longship allowed the Vikings to conduct swift raids on coastal settlements, striking fear into the hearts of those who lived along the shores of Europe. The ships could land on beaches with ease, and their shallow draft allowed them to navigate rivers deep into enemy territories, bypassing traditional defenses and launching surprise attacks. The speed and efficiency of the longships made Viking raids some of the most effective military operations of the medieval period. Despite the violence associated with Viking raids, their ships also facilitated a thriving trade network. The Vikings traded goods such as furs, timber, amber, and slaves, reaching as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world. Their longships were not just tools of war, They were essential for commerce, allowing the Vikings to establish trading outposts in places like Novgorod in Russia, Dublin in Ireland, and York in England. These ships were the key to both the Viking economy and their ability to interact with a vast array of cultures, from the Franks to the Arabs. In the end, the Viking longship was not just a vessel, it was a symbol of the Viking way of life. It represented their resourcefulness, their mastery over the sea, and their ability to turn the challenges of their environment into opportunities for expansion, exploration, and conquest. Through their longships, the Vikings reached distant shores, discovered new lands, and left a mark on history that would resonate for centuries. The cold seas, once a barrier to human survival, became a highway for the Vikings, guiding them to new worlds and ensuring their place in the annals of history. During the long, harsh winters of Scandinavia, when the cold and darkness seemed unrelenting, the Viking people found solace and joy in their winter festivals. These celebrations were more than just a respite from the physical hardships of winter, they were vital to the emotional and social fabric of Viking society. The long winter nights, filled with stories around the fire, were punctuated by these communal feasts, which not only brought warmth and light into the darkness but also reinforced the bonds of kinship, community, and tradition. The Viking calendar was deeply connected to the cycles of nature, and the winter solstice, which marked the longest night of the year, held particular significance. For the Vikings, the solstice was a powerful moment, symbolizing the rebirth of the sun and the beginning of the slow return of light after the darkness of winter. This was a time to celebrate the promise of brighter days ahead, to honor the gods, and to renew the communal ties that held society together. The celebrations during the winter months were centered around feasts, sacrifices, and rituals that were meant to honor the gods and secure blessings for the coming year. One of the most important festivals of the Viking winter season was Yule, or Jol, a celebration that took place around the time of the winter solstice. Yule was a festival dedicated to the gods, to the renewal of life, and to the spirits of the ancestors. The Vikings believed that the solstice marked the moment when the sun began to regain its strength, and they celebrated this by lighting great bonfires to symbolize the return of the light. These fires were not just a practical means of keeping warm in the cold, dark nights. They were also a powerful symbol of hope and renewal, signaling the end of the winter's darkest days. Yule was a time of great feasting, and the Vikings took full advantage of the opportunity to indulge in rich food and drink. The long winter months, when hunting and farming were difficult, meant that the food supply could be scarce. But during Yule, the Vikings would slaughter animals that had been fattened up in preparation for the celebration. Pigs, cattle, and sheep were sacrificed, their meat roasted and prepared for the feast. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, was often consumed in large quantities, and the men and women of the community would drink together in a show of unity and shared celebration. But Yule was not just about feasting. It was also a time for honoring the gods, especially Odin, the chief of the gods. Odin was closely associated with both wisdom and war, and his role in Viking culture was pivotal. As the god of the dead, he was also revered as the one who could help guide the souls of warriors to the afterlife. During Yule, sacrifices were made to Odin in hopes of ensuring protection, good harvests, and the favor of the gods in the coming year. In some areas, a special Yule sacrifice was made, where a boar was ritually killed and offered to the gods. The meat of the boar was then shared among the community, symbolizing both the sustenance provided by the gods and the unity of the Viking people. In addition to sacrifices, the Vikings performed rituals and ceremonies during Yule to honor their ancestors and seek their guidance. The spirits of the deceased were believed to return to the world of the living during the winter solstice, and the Vikings would make offerings to them, asking for their wisdom and protection. These ceremonies were often held at sacred sites, such as groves, hilltops, or by the shores of lakes, where it was believed the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was thinnest. The Vikings would light torches, say prayers, and offer food or drink to the spirits, believing that by doing so, they would receive blessings in return. The Yule festival was also a time to honor the cycle of nature itself. In a land where survival depended so much on the changing seasons, the Vikings had a deep respect for the forces of nature. They believed that the solstice marked not only the return of the sun but also the renewal of the earth. In some regions, the Vikings would bring greenery into their homes, decorating with holly, ivy, and mistletoe, which were seen as symbols of fertility and rebirth. The Yule tree, a tradition that continues in modern Christmas celebrations, may have its roots in Viking practices of decorating trees to honor the gods. But the festivals were not only about the gods, they were also an opportunity for the community to come together and celebrate their shared identity. The Viking society was built on close-knit communities where kinship ties were paramount. During Yule and other winter festivals, these bonds were reinforced through communal feasts, games, and shared rituals. The feast was the centerpiece of these celebrations, and it was not just about eating, it was about solidarity and unity. The Viking people understood that to survive the long winters, they needed each other. The feast was a reminder of the importance of community, a way to come together and share in both the abundance and the hardships of life. During the feasts, tales of heroes, gods, and ancestors were told, as storytellers recounted the deeds of warriors and kings. These stories helped to preserve the history and culture of the Vikings, ensuring that the younger generations would know the importance of their heritage. The feasts were also marked by the exchange of gifts, further strengthening the ties between families and communities. The act of giving was seen as a way to honor one another, to share in the bounty of the earth, and to ensure good fortune for the coming year. As the nights grew longer and the days colder, the Vikings would celebrate the festivals with a mixture of solemnity and joy. They knew that the long, dark winter was a time of rest and reflection, but also one of renewal and hope. The Yule festivities marked the turning of the year, a symbolic rebirth of the sun and a reminder that no matter how long or cold the winter might be, there would always be the promise of spring and new life on the horizon. In addition to Yule, other winter festivals were held throughout the season, each with its own unique customs and traditions. For example, the Viking New Year, or Nyttår, was a time of reflection on the past and preparation for the future. It was a time for honoring the gods and ancestors, making offerings, and setting intentions for the coming year. This celebration was often marked by drinking, feasting, and sharing stories, much like Yule, but with an added focus on looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The winter festivals, with their blend of feasting, sacrifice, and celebration, were essential to the Viking way of life. They offered a much-needed respite from the harshness of the long winter months and provided a sense of connection to both the divine and the community. The Vikings understood that life was fragile, especially in the brutal northern winters, but through their festivals, they reinforced their resilience and their hope for brighter days ahead. These celebrations were not just about surviving the winter, they were about embracing the cycle of life, honoring the gods and ancestors, and reaffirming the ties that bound the Viking people together. The Viking warrior ethos is legendary, brutal yet honorable, fierce yet disciplined. During the long winters, when the cold set in and the land became inhospitable, the Vikings did not rest from their identity as warriors. Their culture was built on combat, survival, and the constant preparation for war. But it wasn't just physical strength that defined the Viking warrior. It was the spirit of resilience, honor, and unity that bound them together, even in the bleakest of winters. Training for battle began in childhood, and it was a way of life. From an early age, Viking boys were taught to wield weapons, swim, and endure hardship. The Vikings believed that strength of body and mind was essential for survival, and this included preparing for the eventuality of battle. The long winter months, with their isolation and cold, were not a time to slacken. Instead, they became an opportunity to sharpen both the physical and mental discipline required of a warrior. Boys would practice with wooden weapons, learning the basics of sword fighting, shield defense, and archery. As they grew older, their training intensified, preparing them for the bloody realities of Viking warfare. Strength, however, was not just physical. The Viking warriors were taught the value of inner fortitude, resilience, and unwavering courage. In the harsh winter conditions, where survival was a daily struggle, these qualities were tested to their limits. Yet, the Viking warriors faced these challenges head-on, using every experience as an opportunity to build mental and emotional endurance. To be a Viking was to face adversity with strength, And this was no more evident than during the long, lonely winters when raiders would prepare their minds for distant campaigns or to defend their villages. Viking warriors were trained in the art of battle, but they were also taught the importance of strategy, tactics, and brotherhood. Raids were not merely acts of brutality, they were highly organized and carefully executed. The Viking warrior culture valued cunning as much as it did brute force. They understood the power of surprise and the importance of timing. This knowledge was passed down through generations, often shared in the long winter nights around the hearth. The stories of previous raids, of victories won through clever strategy, were not just entertainment but lessons on how to be a better warrior. In many ways, the winter months, though isolating, were a period of reflection and preparation for future battles. Even in the midst of winter's harshness, a Viking warrior's sense of duty and honor was never diminished. Their bond with their brothers in arms was sacred, and loyalty was held in the highest regard. The brotherhood forged through shared struggle, whether through the struggle to survive the winter or to fight together on the battlefield, was one of the cornerstones of Viking warrior culture. The connection between warriors went beyond friendship. It was a pledge of mutual respect and support, grounded in the understanding that survival, both in war and in life, depended on the strength of these bonds. The Vikings' warrior training was also about mental preparedness for the harshness of war and the stark realities of battle. Viking warriors had a belief in fate, or WRD, which guided their approach to life and death. They believed that their destinies were woven into the fabric of the universe, and that death in battle was the ultimate honor. To die valiantly was to secure a place in Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where warriors who had fought bravely would spend eternity feasting and fighting. This belief was crucial in shaping their mindset, as the Vikings did not shy away from the brutality of battle but embraced it, knowing that their courage and strength would ensure their place in the afterlife. The preparation for battle was also linked to the Viking understanding of the world around them. They knew that the elements were just as deadly as any enemy. The cold, the snow, the frozen ground, these were not obstacles to be feared but conditions to be understood and used to their advantage. Viking warriors trained not only in combat but in how to withstand the unforgiving environment in which they lived. Winter was a time to hone survival skills, whether it was tracking prey through the snow, enduring long marches through icy terrain, or learning to fight in the deep cold while wearing layers of heavy armor and clothing. The harsh environment only made the Viking warrior stronger, tougher, and more determined to survive. The weapons of the Viking warriors were as much a part of their identity as their training. The sword, axe, and spear were the primary tools of combat, and each weapon held a sacred place in Viking culture. The sword, often passed down through generations, was more than just a tool for killing. It was a symbol of the warrior's honor and status. The Viking warrior took great care in maintaining his weapons, even in the winter months when the harsh conditions could cause wear and tear. A well-maintained weapon was a reflection of the warrior's discipline and his commitment to the values of his people. Axes, in particular, were prized for their versatility and effectiveness in close-quarters combat. They were also useful in everyday life, whether for chopping wood to stave off the cold or for felling trees to build shelters. For the Viking warrior, every tool, every weapon, was part of a larger strategy for survival. This mindset extended beyond just the tools of war. It was embedded in the Viking worldview. Everything, from the smallest task of gathering firewood to the most dramatic raid, was a matter of preparation, resilience, and unity. Honor was a central tenet of Viking warrior culture. The concept of fullaus, headless, was a fate worse than death for a Viking. Living without honor was seen as the ultimate disgrace. A Viking warrior could face death with courage, but to live without honor was to live as nothing. This belief was instilled in every warrior from childhood, and it guided their actions both on and off the battlefield. The importance of honor also meant that revenge was an integral part of Viking society. If a warrior's honor was insulted, it was his duty to avenge the slight, often leading to cycles of blood feuds that could last for generations. For the Vikings, winter was not a time of stagnation. It was a season of reflection, planning, and preparing for what would come next. Their fierce training and adherence to the warrior code were not abandoned during the cold months. In fact, Winter served as a crucible, a time to sharpen not only the body but the spirit. They would emerge from the winter months prepared to face the challenges of the coming year, whether those challenges involved raids, battles, or the simple struggle for survival. But it wasn't all about battle. The Viking warriors understood the importance of camaraderie, shared struggle, and the bond of brotherhood. The bonds formed during the long winter months of training, storytelling, and feasting were just as important as the physical training they underwent. These relationships were what made the Viking warrior culture unique. Those who fought together in battle were often bonded for life, and the trust that they had in one another was unshakable. As winter gave way to spring and the thawing of the land, the Viking warrior would be ready. His body honed, his mind sharpened, and his honor intact, he would march forward, prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, whether in the form of war, survival, or the next winter's bitter cold. When the world outside froze under a blanket of snow and ice, the Vikings' survival skills came to the forefront. Living in the cold, harsh environment of Scandinavia meant that survival was never guaranteed, especially during the long, unforgiving winters. The Vikings did not have the luxury of waiting for nature to soften its grip. Instead, they adapted to the extreme conditions, relying on their knowledge of the land, their resourcefulness, and their ability to endure hardship. Winter, for them, was not just a season, it was a challenge, a test of both physical endurance and mental resilience. The Vikings' survival during the winter months depended on their profound understanding of the natural world around them. From the food they stored to the shelters they built, every aspect of their lives was influenced by the cold, dark winters. This environment shaped their daily routines and their social structures. The long nights and limited daylight meant that their bodies and minds had to be attuned to a different rhythm, one that required patience, foresight, and a deep respect for the forces of nature. One of the most important survival skills for the Vikings during winter was the ability to find and preserve food. The cold made farming and hunting more difficult, so the Vikings relied heavily on their ability to store food for the long months ahead. They would butcher animals before the coldest months arrived, salting, drying, or smoking the meat to preserve it. The Vikings were skilled in the art of curing meat and fish, ensuring that they had enough protein to sustain them when fresh food was scarce. Fish, particularly dried cod, was a staple in their diet, as it could be preserved for months and was easy to store. In addition to meat, the Vikings relied on their knowledge of local plants and herbs to supplement their diet. While fresh vegetables were not abundant during the winter, they would have stored root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and potatoes, which could survive in the cold soil. They also gathered herbs in the summer months and dried them for use in the winter, adding flavor and nutrition to their otherwise limited meals. Even in the winter, foraging for edible plants could still provide some relief, though it was far more challenging. Vikings were keen observers of their environment and knew which plants could be found under the snow, where to dig for root vegetables, and how to harvest them without damaging the delicate ecosystem. The Vikings were also known for their ability to hunt in the harsh winter conditions. They would use traps and snares to catch animals like deer, rabbits, and boar, and they knew how to track animals through the snow. Hunting in the winter was dangerous and physically demanding, but the Vikings' intimate knowledge of the landscape allowed them to move efficiently and find game even in the most challenging conditions. Their sleds and skis were invaluable tools, enabling them to cover long distances and transport their catches back to the settlement. The cold also helped in preserving the meat immediately after it was hunted, allowing it to be stored for later use. While food was a primary concern, the Vikings also had to think about how to keep warm. Their clothing was designed specifically to endure the cold. They wore layers of woolen tunics and furs, which trapped body heat and provided insulation against the bitter winds. Wool, in particular, was prized for its ability to retain warmth even when wet. The Vikings also wore boots made from animal hides, which helped protect their feet from the snow and ice. These clothes were often handcrafted, and many Viking families would spend the long winter months weaving and repairing their garments, ensuring they had enough to see them through the season. Shelter was another crucial aspect of Viking survival during winter. The Vikings built their homes to withstand the cold and to keep in warmth. The longhouse, with its thatched roof and thick wooden walls, was the centerpiece of Viking settlements. These homes were designed to retain heat, with large hearths in the center of the building that provided warmth and light. The Vikings would gather around the fire, not only for warmth but also to cook their food, tell stories, and engage in community life. The longhouse was a place of both refuge and connection, a symbol of the Vikings' resilience in the face of the elements. The construction of the longhouse was an art in itself. The walls were made of thick timber, and the roofs were constructed in such a way that they shed snow and ice. The windows were small, often covered with animal skins to prevent heat from escaping. Inside, the hearth was the focal point, with smoke rising through a vent in the roof. The heat from the fire would radiate throughout the house, and its warmth would keep the chill of the winter night at bay. In the harshest conditions, when temperatures dropped far below freezing, the Vikings would insulate their homes even further, using animal skins and furs to create a barrier against the cold. In addition to building shelters, the Vikings were adept at navigating and surviving in the frozen wilderness. They were skilled at using the stars and the sun to find their way, even when snowstorms made the landscape nearly invisible. Their knowledge of the land was crucial, as they could identify landmarks even in the darkest of winters. The Vikings would often travel across frozen lakes or snow-covered fields in search of resources or to trade with neighboring communities. Sleds and skis were essential tools for this type of travel, allowing them to move swiftly over the snow and carry goods or hunted animals back to their settlements. For those living in more isolated areas, survival during winter could be especially difficult. Viking settlements were often spread out across the rugged terrain of Scandinavia, and some villages were far from major trade routes. During the winter months, the snow and ice could cut off contact with the outside world for weeks at a time. This isolation meant that Vikings had to be self-sufficient. The strong sense of community that developed during these times was vital for their survival. Families and neighbors would rely on one another for support, whether in terms of sharing food, helping with tasks like repairing tools, or offering protection from potential threats. While these survival skills were practical, they also spoke to the Viking mindset. For them, winter was not something to fear, but a challenge to be overcome. It was a time to show strength, resilience, and unity. As a culture that thrived on exploration, battle, and survival, the Vikings did not retreat in the face of adversity. They adapted, used their resources wisely, and found ways to endure even the most brutal conditions. The long winter months, though difficult, were also a time for reflection, preparation, and connection. The Vikings knew that winter would pass, and with it, the opportunity for new challenges, new adventures, and new raids would come. But to thrive in those future endeavors, they had to survive the present. They did so with grace, strength, and an unwavering will to endure. The Viking ability to survive the frozen landscape of Scandinavia was not just about physical endurance, it was a testament to their spirit, their connection to the land, and their unwavering belief in their ability to face whatever the future held. The Vikings, though often seen through the lens of myth, legend, and fearsome warriors, have left a legacy that transcends time. Their influence can still be felt today in various aspects of modern culture, from our ideas of exploration, to architecture, to language, and even in our understanding of survival and resilience. While much of the world that the Vikings built has been lost to time, their way of life, their values, and their stories continue to inspire and shape the world we live in. The Viking legacy begins with their incredible resilience. Living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, they were a people who understood survival at its most fundamental level. Winter, with its extreme cold and long, dark nights, could break the weak. But the Vikings thrived in this adversity, turning it into a source of strength. Their ability to endure the unforgiving winters of Scandinavia became a defining characteristic of their culture. The skills they developed to survive the cold, building shelters, storing food, crafting clothes, and maintaining community bonds, were not just practical measures but were reflections of their core values. Their survival strategies are as relevant today as they were over 1,000 years ago. In our modern world, where many are far removed from the harshness of nature, the Viking way of life serves as a reminder of the resilience needed to navigate life's challenges. The Vikings taught that survival isn't just about brute strength, but also about resourcefulness, adaptability, and the ability to work together. These lessons have endured because they are universal, qualities that can be applied in any era, no matter the struggle. The Vikings' influence on exploration is another key element of their legacy. Their ability to navigate the seas and venture far beyond their homelands laid the groundwork for the age of discovery centuries later. In their longships, they crossed vast oceans, reaching North America long before Columbus, and establishing trade routes across Europe, the Middle East, and even into Asia. Their maritime prowess and thirst for adventure set the stage for future explorers, from the great navigators of the Renaissance to the modern sailors who charted the world's oceans. The Vikings were among the first to break free from the confines of their immediate surroundings, and in doing so, they expanded the horizons of the world. This spirit of adventure continues to resonate today, with the Viking voyages inspiring countless explorations of both the physical and mental kind. The desire to explore, to go beyond what is known and familiar, is embedded in modern society. Whether through space exploration or our relentless pursuit of knowledge in science, technology, and culture, the Vikings' ability to push boundaries and venture into the unknown remains a defining human trait. Beyond exploration, the Vikings left a profound mark on language, literature, and culture. Their influence on the English language is particularly significant. Many modern English words trace their origins to Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings. Words like sky, leg, and window all have roots in the Viking tongue.